best for Dublin sport. On the ball on Dublin City FM.
Mixed martial arts. No one else talks about it except us.
On the ball.
Dublin City FM.
Hello everybody and welcome to MMA on Dublin City FM as part of the On The Ball sports show here on a Sunday. We come to you usually around the 4 o'clock mark, and if you want to see or listen even to any of our archive shows, you can go to www.thisaintfake.com. Hi Kenny, we're joined by Kenny of course. How are you doing?
Hello Mr. Marshall, how are you?
I'm not too bad, how are things?
Good.
Okay, so we had the first ever head-to-head of Bellator versus UFC this past Friday. And my first question before we talk about the news coming out of both shows is why? Why do Bellator think it's a good idea to go head-to-head against UFC? And they are going to be doing it again in October, I believe.
Well, this wasn't a Bellator idea.
Okay, so this was Spike, was it?
No. Bellator run every Friday, and this was the debut of their season, and that was known a long time in advance. And I mean, the UFC are claiming that it's purely coincidental, but that they were the ones who chose to run this Friday. UFC never normally runs Fridays.
Now, it's very interesting. Word coming out, it's been a couple of days, so we have an idea of the viewership, and supposedly, this really did hurt Bellator. As you said, it was their season premiere. They had stacked the card pretty good. You had Czech Congo, Bobby Lashley, featherweight title fight, King Mo. The majority of their big names, obviously minus Czech Congo, that haven't been brought over from the UFC, the veterans that have been brought over. But it didn't go well for them. Supposedly, most MMA fans tuned in to UFC instead. When this happens in October, is there anything that Bellator can do to try and combat this?
Well, it's a different situation in November. What's happening is there's a UFC show coming from Mexico in November. It's going to be on pay-per-view. It's going to be Cain Velasquez and Fabricio Verdum. So, they're going to be on pay-per-view while Bellator is on free television.
Oh, okay, I understand.
If anything, it could hurt the UFC. But, I don't necessarily think that going to be a hugely bought show, so I don't know. I think you'll still get your 600,000 or so watching Bellator.
Now, the results of Bellator are to follow, but the thing I really want to speak about is literally, I'm trying my very best. I'm going to do my very best not to reference pro wrestling. That's for Wednesdays on thisaintfake.com, but they did what one would only describe as a pro wrestling angle with Stephan Tito and Tito.
Yeah, it was a pro wrestling angle, and if there are some MMA fans out there who are a little bit hurt about that reference, unfortunately, that's exactly what it is. I mean, that's what it was. It was a pro wrestling angle.
It was absolutely horrific. It was.
Did you see, yeah?
I did. I absolutely did. It was the most classless thing I've ever seen on an MMA show. In terms of, I thought it was so contrived, so against what the sport should be. They clearly had seen the Jones-Cormier brawl as something that made a fight a very hot topic, and they decided to contrive something. And this wasn't something as simple as a brawl.
Yeah, if you do a brawl, it's one thing, but what they did was not,
Well, they tried. They gave the impression of a brawl at the end of it, but let's go through it step by step.
Just a bully situation. I mean, basically, you had. I mean, just the fact that you had the two of them out there in the cage, cutting promos already, that's pro wrestling. You don't do that in MMA. How often do you see, Cain Velasquez and Julio Santos just canter on out to the cage with the microphone in their hand? That's pro wrestling stuff. You don't do that in MMA, you know what I mean?
Yeah, this is why I'm describing it as classless, Ken. I just feel that it just poo-poos over the idea of this being a proper sport. And Stephan Bonner's in the ring anyway, and he's cutting this promo, and it is.
Yeah, we're not pro wrestling here.
It is. Sorry?
You said the ring, the cage.
You see, this is how much they've influenced me by it. No. This is how I'm viewing it. So Stephan Bonner, as I stand corrected by my Hulkamaniacs here in the Silverdome, was in the cage, and he was doing an interview. He had a masked man beside him. It looked like a very fat version of the masked magician from those Sky One exposés in the late 90s. It was just... Ken, what was this? This was literally I'm so sorry that I must digress, but this was just such a sham. He was cutting this promo, talking about the man standing beside him, and then he unmasked him. It looked like he took off this black mask, and underneath the black mask, the guy had what seemed to be cling film also wrapped around his face that they then had to take off. Who was this man, and why was he being brought in to I guess it was like this man had a history with Tito? What was the idea?
Okay, so the man who was unmasked was Justin McCulley, okay? Justin McCulley is sometime pro wrestler, sometime MMA fighter, who was a big part of Tito Ortiz's career for a good period in the last decade. But, I mean, Justin McCulley had a couple of UFC fights about a decade ago. He had a couple of matches in Japan Pro Wrestling around the same length of time ago. So, I mean, I'll put it this way, the erstwhile editor of the Wrestling Observer newsletter, Dave Meltzer, did not know who this was when he was unmasked. So if somebody with the knowledge of MMA and pro wrestling of Dave Meltzer looks at this guy and goes, who is that? What on earth was the hope that this crowd were going to, even if they did recognize him, I don't know what Justin McCulley is to Tito Ortiz, do you?
No, this was, going back to pro wrestling, I'm sorry, but we're going to have to just keep comparing it because this is what it was. It was the equivalent of somebody in pro wrestling, a heel, if you will, a baddie, bringing another baddie in and saying you have to go through him before you go through me.
Yeah,
and this big one,
yeah.
And it was as Ken alluded to, the crowd did not take to this because they didn't know who he was.
I didn't know who he was or what was going on.
Just to clarify as well what Ken said, if you guys don't know who Dave Meltzer is, he's the only current journalist still reporting on MMA that did an article on UFC 1.
And also, I mean, he actually judged UFC. He was a judge at UFC 16.
Sure,
so
but he goes, Chris is at the door here, and he's just banging in. Hello, mate, how are you? Yep, they're the sultry tones of him just coming in the door, if that was audible. But this was just out of control, like, and so then basically after he unmasked him, they did a kind of a pull-away brawl. Tito went for Stephan.
Tito started calling them drug addicts.
He did, yeah. And then Tito went for Stephan, and it was like clockwork. It was like Riverdance. It was the most choreographed thing you've ever seen. As soon as he went for him, there was like a body over each guy. And what made it really worse is, forgive me, I've forgotten his name again. Who was the masked man?
Justin McCulley.
Justin was in like absolute grabbing distance of Tito, but he had to kind of stop himself from doing anything. There wasn't enough bodies between him and Tito. So it was just so horrible. And like Bellator, as you said, okay, you clarified earlier that it was UFC's call to run against Bellator, so it's not Bellator punching above their weight, but they are never going to compete, especially going head to head, if they have this absolute drivel in the middle of their card. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, this was just horrendous. But like I said, I didn't actually physically get a chance to see it myself. I was waiting for a high definition download to become available, which happened about an hour ago, so I will see it and report back. But I did see, I saw a lot of screenshots. Just looking at the mask, and it looked like I was watching something from Nitro or Impact or Raw, not something from
Thunder, Ken. Thunder. Okay, enough of that, and we'll talk about the card now. Czech Congo got a victory. Speaking of a sometime pro wrestler who also competes in MMA, Bobby Lashley is the TNA, which is the secondary company, the Bellator of pro wrestling, heavyweight champion. He won, and supposedly in very good fashion, 4 minutes in round 2 by a rear naked choke submission over Josh Burns. Josh Burns doesn't have a Wikipedia page, okay, so that's first and foremost. But it's a bit of a leading question, Ken. How serious about mixed martial arts is Bobby Lashley, and how serious can Bobby Lashley be as a professional wrestler as well, if he's going to try and continue in MMA? Is there ever a chance that UFC will have a look at this guy? Because to me, Bobby Lashley's MMA career seems more like a kind of a hobby on the side than anything else, just judging by who he's fought and where he's fought.
Yeah, well, actually got into MMA in about 2008. That was kind of the idea, was get some seasoning and get to the dance, in a couple of years. But the problem was, he was dividing his time at first between TNA and mixed martial arts. He has a huge body, very muscular, which meant he had no gas for MMA. So he would be fed these dreadful opponents and he would beat them, but he wouldn't look good in doing so because he'd be so gassed out, and so it really slowed his progression. But the idea was still that he was going to move forward in MMA, but then he had some family troubles. His kids were taken halfway across the country, so he he was kind of, his time was divided and he didn't have the time to dedicate to MMA. And at this stage, I mean, the guy is 38 years of age and, you know, his athletic gifts are diminishing. He can't strike. He still doesn't have a gas tank. So, you know, I think this was just a case that Scott Coker came into the Bellator. The two have worked before in Strikeforce. You know, and Scott Coker, unlike the UFC, unlike Bjorn, he does like to gimmick up his shows to do whatever you have to draw people in. So, you know, the fact that they gave him an opponent who has a losing record, you know, I can't remember his record now off the top of my head, but I know he has lost substantially more fights than he's won, which, you know, that says everything you need to know.
Yep. We had King Mo coming back after a couple of defeats, defeating Dustin Jacob by TKO, and Patricio Freire
Patricio Pipco Freire.
Freire, that's exactly what I said. Defeated Pat Kern to win the featherweight championship of Bellator when it went the distance. So this show, I just don't know what to say. It's kind of like it's a nice case study for everything that's wrong with Bellator, I think. Minus the fact that they didn't have a main event featuring UFC has-beens. But they surely made the UFC has-beens featured on the show one way or the other. That's what my lasting memory coming out of it would be. If you haven't got a chance to see the Stephan Tito thing, it is on the internet, easily accessible on YouTube, and just go out of your way to see it and try not to throw up. You saw the UFC main card that went head-to-head with this show. This was it a good show, Ken?
The main card, yeah, was a lot of fun, I have to say. I really enjoyed it.
Okay, so Matt Mitrione and Derek Lewis, heavyweight action, very, very quick. Go through that for us.
Okay, it was 21 seconds, so...
41, Ken, 41.
Basically, Lewis had called Mitrione out after his previous win, which was against one of Mitrione's training partners, so Mitrione didn't take too kindly to that, so they went in, they both got after it, and basically... Lewis was running in, he got caught with a left jab and a forearm to the face, went down. Mitrione finished him on the ground, and that was that.
Semi-main event was Ben Rothwell against Alistair Overeem. This has to be the end, doesn't it, for Alistair? He lost in round 1, 2 minutes 19 seconds with TKO. What's the crack with Alistair? How did he look? Did he have any sort of offense?
Okay, so Overeem, you know, there's a lot of sort of subplots to this fight. Big Ben Rothwell won his last fight, but he was on testosterone replacement therapy at the time, and he was found to have levels above what are acceptable to the athletic commissions, and so he had too much testosterone in his system, for lack of a better way to describe it. The Milwaukee Athletic Commission were actually going to let that go, which kind of says everything you know about the athletic commissions, but the UFC themselves suspended Rothwell for 9 months. This was his first fight back. Overeem had just come off a win against Frank Mir, in which he looked awful. He obviously lost his previous 2 by knockout to Stefan Struve and Bigfoot Silva, and, you know, I think within 90 seconds of the start of this fight, it was like, I was kind of watching going, Overeem really doesn't have anything. And, I mean, you know, Overeem was a middle-of-the-road light heavyweight, and then all of a sudden he gained about 50 pounds of muscle and became the best, you know, one of the best heavyweights in the world. And, you know, obviously over the last few years he's had a couple of failed drug tests. He's off all the supplements in the world. So it's become very, very clear and very, very apparent that any success he did have was based on cheating, for lack of a more subtle way of putting it. And he got knocked out in 2 minutes here. He's always had a glass jaw. It showed again here. And the biggest thing here was the shock wasn't even as shocking as it should have been. You know what I mean? He was a 4-1 underdog here, Rothwell. But when it happened, you kind of just thought, why was he a 4-1 underdog? When was the last time Alistair Overeem looked any good? He beat a sick Brock Lesnar, and that's about it.
Yeah, no. Well, you know, this sport is very much, if you have a good run, your reputation will precede you while you're falling down, it seems. But I was the same going into this. I was like, oh, it's Overeem, you know. But what is Overeem now?
Exactly, yeah. I think the biggest question now is, if you recall, after he beat Frank Mir, he, for whatever reason, I guess he heard rumours that Brock was looking to get back. He called out Brock Lesnar. Do you remember this?
I do, yes.
Don't you think that Brock Lesnar would love to get a rematch of that fight if, as Paul Heyman recently said, he really is healthy?
You know what? And I could see it happening.
I really could, yeah. Especially with his deal being up in April, you know.
Yeah.
Take a year, get another couple of big fights under your belt. another bunch of big paychecks, and then go back to pro wrestling again.
Take a year, go and make sure that you fight people you're going to win, and then come back to pro wrestling and ask for more money.
Yeah, I don't really think the record, matters. But I think if you're going to go to MMA, you're going to have to take the money fights. You know what I mean? I don't think the UFC are going to say, "Here, have Heath Herring." You know what I mean?
What would the money fights for?
That are going to main event pay-per-views. So,
what would the money fights be? A third match with Frank Mir and an Overeem rematch. What else could you see if they had him back?
You'd struggle to sell a Mir fight at this point, given how far he has fallen. I do know that Brock himself, apparently, he's always had a fascination and desire to fight Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira, and Nogueira retired in 2015. So, there's a fight you could make, and whatever you want to say about, it would be like a Legends Tour fight, but it would probably be a money fight,
Sure. The main event was Ronaldo Sousa against Jared Musasi. This was won by Sousa, third round, 4 minutes 30 seconds by a guillotine choke. Did you enjoy this main event?
Yeah, I mean, it was fairly clear within the first 90 seconds of the fight that while Musasi had the better of the striking, he wasn't vastly better. He kind of patterned the striking. He's landed a couple of combos, but the power advantage seemed to be with Jacare. But once Jacare took him to the ground, Musasi had absolutely nothing, and he did it all 3 rounds. And in the third round, he's so fluid and so smooth on the ground that it was just a matter of time until he caught something. And it was like he never really tried to catch something until he tried to catch something. He tried to, he got it,
Excellent stuff. And finally, Ken, before we finish up for this week, we were going to talk last week about the independent drug testing that UFC finally decided to implement. We didn't get a chance to. So, yeah, it is fantastic news. Just even think about what we've discussed today. We're talking about Overeem, we're talking about every week it comes up in conversation. You can't go through a UFC card or a future potential card without speaking about when that guy was on TRT. So let's get a quick breakdown from you on what the UFC are looking into doing and how it will affect fighters, how often they'll be tested, and how the climate will pretty much change.
Okay, they're looking to budget about $2 million over the course of the fiscal year 2014 for random drug testing. This will be both in competition and out of competition. They would hire a body like VADA or USADA or one of the anti-doping agencies. They would cut them a check and say, "This is our roster. You can test whoever you want, whenever you want." And basically, they would obviously dish out the fines, suspensions, themselves. I think it's a positive that they're waiting until 2014 to implement this, because it's kind of like in 1992 when the WWF instituted a similar policy where it's kind of saying to everyone, "Look, whatever you're on, you've got 2 months to get off." And let's not be naive here. I mean, just the fact that Nirvana have done a little bit of increased out-of-competition testing recently, and all of a sudden Vitor fails, Chael fails again, Vonderlei runs. Just the lot of failed tests we've had would indicate that when people who aren't main eventers are suddenly getting out-of-competition testing, we're going to see a lot of failure. And I mean, for them, I guess the one thing they have to really hope is that people take it seriously, people get off stuff now, because otherwise I think it could be a black eye if fights are falling out left, right, and centre come the beginning of next year.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's going to be very interesting to see when it's implemented, because even though they're giving people, or they're giving the fighters a heads up, a warning that you have X amount of time, this is going to basically expose who is using it, because people are going to try and cheat it from the get-go. People will probably eventually get to a stage where they can cheat it after learning how it works, but from the get-go there will be people exposed, and it's going to be very interesting. But overall, it's an extremely positive move, and it's going to be great to have the sport's reputation be a lot cleaner than it is now.
And here's a question for you, Neil. How much of this do you think was inspired by George St. Pierre saying that he won't be back in the UFC until they're doing random out-of-competition drug testing?
It's hard to quantify it, but it's obviously a huge factor. They've had a torrid couple of years when it comes to their named fighters either being injured or retiring or falling from a higher level of competition.
Yeah.
George St. Pierre to them is the prodigal son. They're dying to come back. So it is, it's huge, and they have a very, very, very close, almost to a fault relationship with George. Emotions run high. They both have a very high standard for each other. When they fight, it's a big deal. You know what I mean? So they want him back.
I think as well, one George St. Pierre return fight pays for 2 years of out of competition drug testing, if not more. You know what I mean?
That's an incredible way to look at. That's an incredible way to look at it. Ken, we'll leave it there. Thanks very much for coming on.
No worries. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, if you missed the start of the show or you want to look at our archives, you can go to thisaintfake.com. Our pro wrestling show goes up there every Wednesday, and archives of MMA on the ball will go up usually Sunday night, Monday morning. We'll be back around the same time next week, but now we're going to go to our song from the chosen year 2005. It's Elbow with Great Expectations.
On the ball.
Dublin City FM.